Ladies and gentlemen, financial professionals, welcome once again to this edition of The Brew, where we build relationships every week, or as Brendan likes to say, every Wednesday. It is Wednesday, a little bit afternoon, and my name is John Florance. I am Senior Vice President of Marketing here at E4 Insurance Services, welcoming you once again to our weekly video broadcast. And, I'm going to share with you an idea based on an article that I wrote recently in Aspire magazine. So another just point here for consideration, if you have not been receiving Aspire magazine, go ahead and give us a call here at E4. We'd love to put you on our list, send you out. It's a relatively new magazine for insurance and financial professionals with lots of great information about particularly the area of financial security for your clients. So I encourage you to see that. But we did publish an article in it. I should say I had one of my stories written in it. And I'm going to share a little bit of that story with you today. Hopefully you'll find it illuminating, enlightening, and helpful for your business. So I'm calling this particular presentation Disarming the 1.5 Trillion Tax Bomb. And if you've ever worked with me in the past, you know that this is one of the areas that is a particular interest and concern to me, just the challenges that are being faced by many advisors and clients alike by old, deferred, particularly non-qualified annuity contracts. To illustrate that, I want to tell you a story about a case that I worked on recently. We'll just call them Doris and Cindy. We're two people, two clients of an advisor that I had a close working relationship with. Mom, Doris, was age 85, and she had an only daughter, Cindy, who was age 47 at the time of this conversation. Now, there was a father in the picture as well, Stan. He had passed away a few years early. Both Doris and Stan were physicians. And based on their age, they sort of had the peak of their career sort of in the 80s and in the 90s, and then kind of went through a very nice retirement. But we sat down with Doris and her daughter toward the end of Doris's life because there was a particular challenge that they had, which was as they were kind of looking at what was going to happen to Doris's estate when she passed away, one of the things was standing out to the advisor as a thorny issue. And this was the existence of a non-qualified variable annuity, originally established all the way back in 1981 by her deceased husband, Stan. Now, the problem was this: the current contract value was $950,000, but it had a cost basis of only $50,000. And so the question was this, is that as Doris was looking at the end of her life and her daughter inheriting not only this, but also several other assets from the portfolio, the real problem that was emerging was a $900,000 deferred gain that was going to be taxable to Cindy at Mom's death. So let me put this particular problem into context to show you what I mean by why I think this is kind of an important thing for us to be thinking about as advisors to our clients right now. So in order to put this into context, let's dial the clock back. If Doris was 85 years old in 2023, that would have put her at the time when they initially created that annuity in the 1980-1981 timeframe only 42 years old. So I said she was a physician, as was her husband. So they were sort of at the top of the earning pile, if you will, really good incomes for the both of them, two working parents, a young daughter at the time, and just living life, right? What was it that made them get into that annuity to begin with? We think of annuities today really in terms of some of the living benefits that you can get, like lifetime income, for example, or some of the enhanced death benefits, or even long-term care kinds of benefits that are available. But way back in 1980, there was something else going on. So let's take a brief look at history here and find out really what was it that made Doris and Stan jump into a product like this. So if we kind of look at the time frame from 1980 to 1993, what was going on in the world? We had the Arab oil embargo that was just wrapping up. We had the Iranian hostage crisis. Really didn't resolve until Reagan got into office after he was elected in 1980. We were going through, those of you who were there, if you remember it, stagflation. Stagflation was a stagnant economy that was hampered further by rampant inflation, really creating a lot of hardship for Americans across the board. And when Reagan got elected in cooperation in conjunction with Congress, which is a very rare thing these days, But back in those days, they were able to get through, over the course of a few years, a couple of really major tax bills. We're talking about the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. We're talking about the Tax Equality and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 1982. And we're talking about the Tax Reform Act of 1986. And what those really did was change the look of our taxation system for individuals in a couple of really important ways. And what that might have had an impact on, and when you're looking at the chart here on the screen, is really what started happening in the stock market. We always see, over periods of time, up swings in stock price valuations. But when you kind of look at what was happening prior to 1980, we've had a period of real sort of volatility with not a tremendous amount of growth. And then immediately following these series of tax reforms, we saw a really huge increase in stock price valuations and a real expansive aspect to what was going on in the economy at the time. Now, I'm not saying that there's the correlation is the causation. We know there was a lot of different factors in that, but for individuals, this was a really big thing that was going on, right? So think back again, too, that in 1980, this is actually before working people had access to things like 401ks, didn't exist at the time. And so people who were high income earners were looking for places to put their money to be able to experience some of the growth. And with all of the news, being able to take advantage of the kind of growth that you're seeing on the chart of the S&P 500 right here. So here was the other interesting thing that happened. Over the series of those years, we really look at that period from 1980 to about 1993, we were seeing a couple of things happen. Look at where the highest tax brackets were for the big income earners in the 1970s. As high as 70% for the top earners was being taxed at the federal level. And even when you're looking at capital gains as high as about 35% at the time. All three of those tax acts had the impact of actually reducing personal income taxes, or the highest brackets of those tax rates for a lot of Americans. And you can see those drops, but still in that window of time, income tax, the highest levels between 50 to 70%, and on the other side of it, on capital gains, between 28 and 35%. So if you were a high income earner in those years without the ability to defer chunks of your money into things like IRAs and 401ks, you had to find a place to invest these monies that was going to not give you these kinds of exposure to these kinds of taxes. And this is what happened. So you look at the history of annuity sales. Now, annuities, as we know, have been around forever. I mean, the first modern ones were really from the 1700s. They go way back, actually, as far as 9,000 years to ancient Babylonian, ancient Assyria. They're uncovering annuity contracts. But the modern annuities from the 1700s onwards were really a very sleepy little product that not very many people took advantage of. And so you can see that both in terms of premium dollars going into annuities as well as new contracts at that time in 1980, there was almost nothing. I mean, we're talking maybe 40,000 contracts nationally a year that were being put into deferred individual annuities. Well, as soon as these tax changes happened in Congress, and you had a lot of high income earners, you start seeing an increase in the volume of new annuity contracts, both fixed and variable, as well as enormously growing premium dollars going into that. Now, this was the start of the annuity sort of phase where lots of investors were buying annuities, and it has continued very substantially since then. We know now that annuity sales top in this country over 300 billion a year. But back then, to see these kinds of flows going into this kind of product was really a direct result of the still high tax levels for individuals and people who are earning income, looking for places to be able to shelter their growing assets from a really heavy tax burden. So that's a little bit of what's been going on. Now, you're going, okay, great. So thanks for the history lesson, John, but what does that have to do with me today? Well, I go back to Doris and Cindy and Stan. Of course, Stan has been passed on now, but what about them? They now had, because of what Dad did way back in the 80s when he was at the prime of his career, earning, a great salary, and his wife earning money as well, and looking for places to put money, they put $50,000 into an annuity that had now grown to $950,000, $900,000 deferred gain, which when they die becomes the tax bomb for their beneficiaries or their children specifically. So what's happened? A lot of those clients that bought those annuities have done nothing over the years but continue to defer that. And what we're really seeing today in deferred annuities across the country is an account balance across the board of over $3.3 trillion. This is according to 2022 Libra facts that we just confirmed recently. $3.3 trillion. And if you look at that a little bit closer, it's a little bit more than half of it truly that is in non-qualified deferred annuities. And these are the ones that are really problematic because when mom and dad die, these things become literally tax bombs. And so question that I ask is, what can you do about it? I like to think of annuities, particularly deferred annuities, as kind of like a little bit of cake and frosting. And I like my cake and frosting, don't get me wrong. But when people die, if the deferred gains, continue to pile up over the years, like in Cindy and Doris's case, you have a very small basis and really high gains, which for the person who has to digest that piece of cake becomes very not attractive, let's say, and not the best situation. In the case of Cindy, taking that death benefit from her mom would have plunged her into the absolute highest tax bracket on over $900,000 of gain. And that would have been really problematic for her. Now, if we extrapolate that out and look at it, it's not just Cindy and Doris that are facing this, but in your book, you have probably dozens of clients who are in similar situations, old, non-qualified annuities that have been, I like to call them lazy assets, not doing much, but sitting there in deferred tax status. And so the question is what can we do with those and how can we help those clients out better? And I've outlined in the article 3 different options that you can do. First option is this: repurpose the annuity, right? So the first thing to do is sit down with that client, have a conversation with them about what was the purpose. And in many cases, for a lot of those people, it was just tax deferred growth. That's really what it was. But maybe their financial objectives have changed. So it's possible now that you could take an old existing annuity and use something like an annuity max strategy, where either through a series of systematic withdrawals or potentially through annuitization of that contract, you might be able to fund something like a tax-free life insurance policy that could be passed on to the kids or the grandkids or to your charity or anybody else down the line. But using insurance to kind of move that money in a more tax-free or more tax-favorable situation. The other really, really attractive idea, particularly in light of the fact that so few Americans are covered for long-term care, is maybe use those old annuities as a means of funding a new long-term care annuity case. So being able to take those distributions, funnel them in either to a life pay on a life chassis or a traditional premium-based long-term care, or even into a new styled long-term care annuity could be a potential option there to repurpose that asset. The other possibility that you have is exchange it. So in many cases, particularly with variable annuities, we have situations where you've got contracts that are rather expensive, fees ranging from as little as 0.5% to as much as maybe 5% in the worst cases that I have seen, in between sub-account expenses and mortality and expense charges and potential life and death benefit riders on those contracts, really expensive contracts that are basically placeholders and it could maybe be used and exchanged into something that is more favorable to the client. How do I mean more favorable? Today, for example, you could move an old variable annuity into a fixed annuity. We've seen MYGAs today, 3, 5, 7 years, over 5% guaranteed for that period of time. So remove all the risk altogether, or potentially move into something like a fixed indexed annuity that has lower or no fees, potentially no risk at all, depending on how you're allocating the assets in that contract, and potentially better lifetime benefits as well. So looking into that as an opportunity to move an old contract into a newer annuity contract to kind of get better outcomes for the client. The other possibility, and one that we looked at closely for Cindy and Doris, was the idea of a post-death 1035 exchange. And this is something a lot of advisors haven't heard of. A few years ago, the IRS issued new guidance that suggested that they were okay with a person who had died with an old deferred non-qualified annuity, and even qualified ones in some cases, but you're still subject to the 10-year payout rules. But in the non-qualified space, you can take that death benefit rather than have it pay out immediately. You can 1035 it into a new contract in the beneficiary's name. Now, there's still going to have to be a payout and a distribution of that contract, but you can arrange it in different ways, potentially, again, eliminate fees, risk, and still maintain control of the asset for the client. But look into that if you have a client who's passed away recently as a means to be able to do a post-death 1035 exchange. And the last option is something you might consider is actually gifting the annuity. Again, depending on the structure of the existing contract, whether it's owner-driven or annuitant-driven, you're really looking at the possibility of gifting that to somebody else to sort of begin unwinding some of the deferred gains within there. In the qualified space, you have the ability to gift qualified annuities up to $100,000. Or another idea, particularly for the non-qualified versions of them, is annuitize the contract first, which then allows you to have a tax exclusion ratio, part basis, part gains, spread that out over a remaining lifetime or potentially over a new annuitant's lifetime, where you might be able to stretch that over many, many years, kind of reduce the taxable impact of that. So every case, of course, is unique, different, needs to be looked at specifically to see what is possible within there. But I would encourage you that as you are thinking about your clients and thinking about these old books, these lazy assets of deferred annuities, look at the idea of repurposing, potentially exchanging it for a new annuity contract or gifting it for the advantage to the client. So in review, where are we at? We've got 3.3 trillion in deferred annuities that are out there, what I consider to be lazy assets. Many of these have the potential of becoming really problematic for your clients, at least their beneficiaries. In some cases, kind of really resulting in tax bombs. And then lastly, there are alternatives to be able to take action today to do something to create better outcomes for your clients. And those were the three ideas that I mentioned before: repurpose, exchange, or gift. So I would encourage you, as we wrap up today's session, take a look inside your book. Annuities that are out of surrender, especially non-qualified annuities, are really great candidates. Any of your clients age 70 to 85, take a look at that, sort them out. People who are at risk of dying with existing annuities in their portfolios. And lastly, any clients with large tax deferred gains in old annuities or in old life insurance are really great candidates to have conversations to bring their annuities up to date. And what I would really encourage you at the end of this is about reach out to your E4IS regional vice president. They can give you in-depth analyses on any of your old annuities and provide you with lots of different options that you can use. So that's my presentation for today. Again, you can read about this in Aspire magazine. This article was written up with the exact same bullet points that we shared today, a little bit more detail. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is John Florance. We will bring Dan Jaworczyk on, and that'll be on the 20th. Next week, we're going to be having Andrew Herrera from North American Insurance, and he's going to be talking about a really interesting idea, which is using life insurance not for the death benefit, but using life insurance for the living. Join us next week, won't you, here on The Brew. Look forward to seeing you then. Thanks.